All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, my intrepid A-Push students. We only have 2 days, including today, of class notes left here during time period 4. Most of our material will correspond to your AMSCO chapters 10 and 11. Let's get ready to roll. It's going to be a fairly short day of notes today. And again, we will have some specifics as we did last class. But like last class, we are also going to be kind of focusing on a big picture. Okay. The big picture we want to get into today could be framed as a potential LEQ, long essay question prompt. How will America develop a unique culture during the 1800s? Okay. So we want to keep in mind, what do we mean by culture? And what will be unique about American culture developed here during time period 4 in the first half of the 1800s? How will it play out moving forward into the second half of the 1800s and beyond? So, what is culture? What is American culture? And how is it formed during the 1800s? One thing we want to keep in mind is literary and artistic achievements. Certainly in the world of literacy and art, we find what we mean by culture in many respects. Um, to that end, up until the 1800s, this notion of artistic achievement, as it were, was very much a an afterthought for Americans. Certainly, there had been an effort towards forming a government in the 1700s, and a lot of the intellectual class probably would have focused their literary attentions towards, the writings of the Enlightenment that we talked about in forming of government, right? The John Locke's, the Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Baron de Montesquieu. Um, but in terms of just literature, art, as it were, that is largely seen as a pastime for the wealthy. Most Americans are focusing on just, how do we make a living in this new world? Okay. Um, Americans pushing west. How do we survive on the frontier? When America kind of puts on, as I've said before, her big boy pants, right, in the wake of the War of 1812, this nationalism that emerges as a result, there is increasingly an American culture that's formed around literature. And we see this in uh, books like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, The Last of the Mohicans. Authors like Herman Melville, Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne. So, for the first time, there is attention paid to literacy and artistic achievements in the United States. There's also a number of reform movements about how do we make society, culture better. Okay. One of the major reform movements is transcendentalism, a focus on living a simple, natural life. We see authors like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, writing about the simplicity of nature, self reliance, nature and self reliance being Ralph Waldo Emerson's famous work. Henry David Thoreau in New England, writing about living alone in the woods. There's an American desire, an American ethos for this notion of self reliance and simplicity. But that's not the only reform movements that are taking place. There is an effort in America to kind of create a perfect society. You know, this notion of kind of American exceptionalism that I think I've spoken about as America enjoys this period of nationalism, this pride in being America. Well, how will America become distinct, become unique? And certainly there's a drive towards a series of utopias, perfect societies in America. We see these uh, communities formed, especially throughout the Midwest, New Harmony out in Indiana. Um, You see, and the names of these places like New Harmony, right? That Union Grove in Minnesota that imply this kind of perfection achieved on the American frontier. Um, Small ideal societies. Some of them, very much as we're going to get into the Second Great Awakening here, formed with religion in mind. Probably my favorite story is that of the Shakers. The town that I got married in, that I told you about, we took a look at the picture of the village square in Harvard, Massachusetts, was at one time a Shaker community. Shakers, their form of utopia, prohibited all intermingling between genders, between men and women, to the point that you go and visit the Shaker graveyards, and women are buried on one side and men are buried on the other. They thought they would have such a perfect society that their population would increase by people's desire to live there. They did not count on that not being a perfect way of living and not drawing in enough people. And of course, it may come as a shock to you, but it takes a man and a woman to procreate. The Shakers soon died off. A lot of these utopian communities don't make it, but they get an A for effort, their effort to create this perfect American society. Um, we see the advent here of the Mormon Church, Joseph Smith and Brigham Young leading the Mormon community out in Utah. Um, some of their practices, like polygamy, are at odds with federal laws. But in essence, here, the Mormon community is just an example of this American movement towards creating this perfect society, creating utopias. As I said, many of them are as a result of what we will call the Second Great Awakening. And you'll recall we had spoken previously about the First Great Awakening, which did result in kind of an American willingness to question authority and a rise in American Christian denominationalism. We see some of the same effects by the Second Great Awakening, and we see some of the same traits in the Second Great Awakening that we saw in the first. We see this fervent kind of tent revival spreading of religion across America. It's a re emphasis, a rededication of religious matters into the daily lives of individuals. But it puts the onus on the individual that we are responsible for seeking salvation. We are responsible for improving society, thus, right, the creation of these utopias in America. It also has that same result of a lot of Christian denominations being formed and being spread, but it's this general re emphasis no matter the region. And remember, we're talking a lot about regions now. We have the North and the South and the West. And no matter what region we're in, we see the growth of the church in America and a re emphasis on the church in America. Again, classified under these reform movements in American culture. That's something, we opened up talking about what is unique about American culture in the 1800s. And this idea of reform certainly applies. It applies to the Second Great Awakening, and in turn implies to the creation of these utopias. Some of the other aspects of reform could refer to what we had already talked about with respect to women. That throughout the 19th century, women are a part of this cult of domesticity, that they are seen best as wives and housewives, mothers, perhaps personal servants, domestic servants, caretakers, perhaps as teachers. But there's the beginning notion of, is there more for women? That they can get involved in this industrial revolution in terms of gaining work in the factories. Um, that there's a willingness to question, and we'll dive into this a little bit further later, about women's role in society and politics. At this point, keeping in mind, right, that women can't vote, they can't sit on juries, um, they can't inherit property. And so we're going to see an emerging willingness to question the role of women in society. I might venture that some of that is an outgrowth of the Second Great Awakening, although many of those Christian denominations also espouse the theory that women should remain as a part of the cult of domesticity. But certainly, from the perspective of American political life, you will see throughout the later half of time period four and into certainly the second half of the 19th century a growing movement for women's rights. Some of the other reform movements that take place include abolitionism, temperance. Okay. Abolitionism we'll talk about as a standalone topic today. The abolishing of slavery. And of course, that is going to be an incredibly divisive issue as the country heads towards civil war. The temperance movement is really all about reform of alcohol. And there's going to be a tie in we will see when we dive further into the later periods of the Industrial Revolution, where we're going to see a return of the temperance movement led in large part by women because there are seriously ill effects of the alcohol abuse we see prevalent in especially the North, the industrial North, and the dangerous occupations, whether it be through infrastructure or through factories. Um, and so women are going to play a role in both of those movements, as well as I said here at the tail end of time period for 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention, led in particular, most notably by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, where they produced the Declaration of Sentiments, fighting for and planting the initial seeds for uh, a feminist movement, for lack of a better term. Sojourner Truth is a woman who fights not just for women's rights, but also for abolition of slavery, for pacifism, for equality. And so I think it's important to recognize the beginning of this movement, especially as we're working on this project. Think about how we can incorporate the beginning of a women's rights movement and who are some of the key players there. One of those key women locally is Dorothea Dix. You're probably familiar with her name from the state park. Dorothea Dix works on the notion of prison reform in particular. Um, American prisons in the 1800s are absolutely abysmal. As the notes say here, far behind the European standards of the time. Violent criminals locked up with the mentally ill. No efforts at reform whatsoever in terms of rehabilitation for the criminal, but prisons are seen as purely punitive. Dorothea Dix leads a advocation of mental health awareness and prison reform in the sense that prisons can be real rehabilitative. That's really what the goal should be: is to rehabilitate the lives of criminals and to break the chains, literally and figuratively, of who is locked up and rehabilitating them and getting them back out to be productive members of society. Again, women playing a major role in some of these emerging reform efforts we see take root in the 1800s. We also see an effort towards the birth of an educational policy in the United States. Prior to the 1800s, there had been no standard for educational policy in the United States whatsoever. During the 1800s, at least states individually began to pass compulsory attendance laws to keep children in school. Um, Remember, some of this is probably in a response to the emerging trend of child labor in the factories, especially up north. Um, we see certain advocates like Horace Mann, who argues for better school resources, better buildings, better uh, distribution of materials and textbooks, and longer school days, and a wider curriculum. And so, again, schools, prisons, women's rights, temperance, and of course, abolition are some of the major reform movements of the day. So abolitionism is one that we probably want to focus on in particular, because I think it's probably that which has the greatest effect on American history moving forward. Abolitionism simply being defined as the movement to abolish slavery, to do away with slavery. I don't like to define a word with a word, but I did it right there. Slavery is present in the North and the South. Okay. It's definitely much more present in the South. And we talked about why when we talked about the Industrial Revolution and its impact with respect to the growth of King Cotton in the South. Um, there had been a time where slavery had kind of faced this uncertain future in the 1780s and the 1790s. You'll recall some even revolutionary thinkers and authors like Thomas Paine had advocated for the abolition of slavery. Probably one of the first to recognize what we've been calling this year, right? The Great American Contradiction. And there could have been a window for slavery to dissipate in America. But when the cotton gin arrives in 1793 and really takes root and radically changes the ability of the American South to produce cotton on a much more rapid and efficient basis, which in turn feeds, as we said in our last class, the emerging, increasingly mechanized industrial textile industry in the North. The demand for this cheap labor increases radically. And there's no doubt that cotton becomes the king of the American South. And for that matter, really the number one product in the American economy in total. Because if our industrial product at the time is primarily textiles, it is, as we said earlier, necessarily dependent upon the production of king cotton in the South. So Southerners race to grow more of the crop to feed the textile mills in the North. And as I said, it creates a huge demand for slave labor, which Northern manufacturers are absolutely willing to live with. They may not share the same guilt, as it were, of employing the slaves themselves, or at least to the same extent that the South does, but they're more than willing to turn a blind eye, at least, to the slave economy that exists in the South, because it benefits them greatly in their production of textiles in the North. In fact, towards the middle of the 19th century, from around 1850, cotton accounts for half of all of the U.S. exports, and 75% of the cotton used in Great Britain comes from the American South. There are, as we're in this period of reform, of course, there are movements to oppose slavery. There's this notion, right, that the American South is nothing but wealthy plantations, slave owning plantations. We know that is really not the case. In the antebellum period, and antebellum is simply defined as prior to the war, there really isn't, it's not like Gone with the Wind with these massive plantations and massive slave holding operations. In fact, only about a quarter of families in the South own slaves at all. And most of those who own slaves own, an amount you can count on a single hand. There's only about 2% of Americans in the South own plantations with 50 or more slaves. But nevertheless, their lobby, as it were, and their political power is immense. There is very much an oligarchy of rich slaveholders in the South. Um, and much like we saw through, right, Bacon's Rebellion, there's an ability to create a divide based upon race between even those poor non-slave holding whites who engage in what we would call today probably aspirational politics. They support the slave system, even though it doesn't really benefit them, in the hopes that one day they too could rise up and become a larger slave holder. Some of this, I think it's important to know, is absolutely rooted in this notion of racial superiority that we see, the white supremacy that we see traced back towards Bacon's Rebellion in the Chesapeake area. On a grander scale, the abolitionist movement continues to grow. And this reform movement in particular becomes inherently tied into this movement that we see towards an American culture. Okay. And what I'm talking about here is the printed word. And we would talk now about two individuals in particular, a man and a woman. Um, Harriet Beecher Stowe writes Uncle Tom's Cabin. And we'll take a look at this a little bit later when we get into the Civil War, because it's actually published in 1852, beyond our time period now. But it's so powerful that it is rumored that when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he said to her, on account of her work, which was a work of fiction, but was so well done and so powerful that it persuaded many people uh, in America and abroad in Europe to take part in this abolitionist movement. He said, "So you're the little lady who started this whole war." We also see abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, okay, who is a newspaper publisher who publishes The Liberator. Um, and his effort there, of course, is to muckrake, as it were, and to drive up sentiment against slavery. And so, probably, as I said earlier, the most significant reform movement of the 1800s is that of the abolitionist movement. Um, there are different tacks to take during this movement. Um, some, in fact, argue for returning slaves to Africa. The African country of Liberia is set up for just that purpose. Its capital, Monrovia, named, of course, after President James Monroe. And if you take a look at the flag of Liberia here, it looks very similar, does it not, to the American flag? We also see a growing number of political divides and political parties um, as an outgrowth of this abolitionist movement. We saw some of that in our video from Daniel Jost the other day. The Liberty Party forms in 1840. That is a straight up abolitionist party. The Free Soil Party forms in 1848. Different from the Liberty Party, the Free Soil Party, and this is important, isn't necessarily an abolitionist party, but just argues that no slavery should be allowed in new territories added. So slavery should be abolished just in the American West as states are formed, and shouldn't be allowed anymore in states north of when we get to the Missouri Compromise, the 3630 line. We'll get to that. The Republican Party forms in the 1850s, and the Republicans are largely a northern anti-slavery party, uh, which their creation will largely kind of break down that Whig party that we talked about when we see the election of William Henry Harrison back in 1840. So this notion of abolitionism is present not just in uh, the world of literary achievements, not just in the world of American society and culture, but absolutely fundamental in forming American politics in the mid 1850s. Uh, there are free slaves, or sorry, I should say free blacks, right? Former slaves in the South and the North. Um, some of them had been emancipated back in the Revolutionary Age. Some of them are simply freed mulattoes, typically light skinned blacks that were born as a result of a black slave woman and a white master. And we can characterize those relationships in a number of different ways, as we talked about when we looked at the Thomas Jefferson Hallie Semmings controversy. But there are free slaves in the North. There are free blacks even in the South. Um, in all cases, life for Black Americans is at the bottom rungs of society. Even in the North, if you're a free Black, only the lowest jobs are available to you. Um, there are absolutely there's no sense even in among the free populations of equality, um, of economic opportunity, and I want us to keep that in mind as we continue to explore kind of the abolitionist movement and what's going to happen when slavery does get abolished and what's going to happen as a result of the Civil War and Reconstruction. And we're going to get into Jim Crow America. It's a very complicated story to be told. It includes, as we will continue to explore, untold violence, extreme violence, lynchings, uh, and it's a dark period in American history that we need to come to terms with and reconcile. One of the biggest advocates and most fascinating stories to be told, and we'll take a look at a couple of them. John Brown is one of my favorite abolitionist stories, and we'll get to him when we get to the prelude to the Civil War here. But another one much earlier is Nat Turner. Nat Turner is a slave in Virginia, and in 1831, Nat Turner leads a slave rebellion. He attacks several plantations and up and kills many of the white slaveholders and inhabitants on those plantations. His men are later captured and executed, but the interesting aspect of Nat Turner's story is, well, on the first hand, trying to imagine the extreme abuse and violence that he witnessed that led to uh, his rebellion in the first place. Okay. What has to happen in order for someone like Nat Turner to take the actions that he took, right? Secondly, is what happens as a result of Nat Turner's rebellion. So, what I would like you to do right now is on this slide, pause me and check out the video that I have linked here. Okay. We'll come back to the notes for 1 or 2 more slides after this. If you just watched that video, I think what's interesting is the result that we need to get to is how Nat Turner's rebellion strengthened the resolve of Southerners to control slaves. Um, some Southerners may have seen this as an opportunity to shut down slavery, uh, to maybe take note of why, as I said earlier, Nat Turner is rebelling. And others see it as no more than an argument to increase control. That in fact you need to tighten up your grip on the slaves. You need to tighten up your grip on freed blacks, rescind their rights. Make sure there's no voting by blacks. Make sure they can't purchase guns. Make sure they can't testify in courts. And so even prior to the abolition of slavery, you have elements taking place that would, kind of indicate the forthcoming Jim Crow era segregation. And so, one of the things we want to get into and spend some time in is, what this means in terms of the growth of slave patrols and the birth of American policing. The story of Nat Turner is fascinating in and of itself, but certainly for the effects that it has on uh, the American South and slavery in the American South. A lot of what we covered today, guys, as I said, is in chapters 10 and 11. As we work on our projects, please, please, please make sure you have completed the reading and the annotation of these chapters for your project and for your assessment that we're going to have in just a couple class periods now. Okay. For the rest of the time in class, you guys watching this at home, please get to work on your project. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is all I got for you today. So get to work. Hit me up if you need me. Thanks, guys. Talk to you soon.